All right, good morning, committee. We're going to go ahead and get started. The first item on the agenda, are there any bill introductions this morning? Representative Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. RS 1058, introducing, it is a blue ribbon task force on the future of higher education.
All right, committee, you've heard the bill introduction. Is there a second? Second by Representative Francis. All those in favor of the bill introduction say aye. Aye. Opposed? Bill is introduced. Any further bill introductions this morning? All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and move on, and I'm going to open the hearing on Senate Bill 14, which is providing for continuous state budgets until amended, lapsed, or eliminated by the legislature, temporary reallocations, and establishing conditions and limitations. So to give us a bill brief on Senate Bill 14, I would invite Jill Walters, the First Assistant Reviser of the Office of the Reviser of Statutes. Jill?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. What Senate Bill 14 does is provides for a continuous budget for the ensuing fiscal years when the legislature and the governor do not enact a new budget bill into law. The existing appropriations provided for in the previous fiscal years are in effect for the new fiscal year, and then all subsequent fiscal years until amended, revised, elapsed, or eliminated by the legislature. So no action is needed by the State Finance Council for these continuing appropriations to continue on. State Finance Council action is required in the following instances: if a continuing appropriation that is made to match or secure federal funds is in excess of the amount required to match those funds, then the State Finance Council would have to approve the expenditure of those funds. When they have temporary reallocations from SGF accounts and funds, the State Finance Council has to approve those. And they have to do that if they find in the accounts there's a receivable amount or money's anticipated to be received, so they would be able to be repaid into those funds. So I will go now into the details of the bill. So basically, if the legislature, if this were in effect into a law right now, for this year, if the legislature and the governor couldn't come to an agreement on a bill, then what would happen is the amount that a agency was appropriated in fiscal year 25 would continue on as the amount they were appropriated for fiscal year 26. So to play that out, if nothing, if a bill couldn't be reached, or excuse me, an agreement couldn't be reached and a bill passed and become into law, then it would just continue from the previous fiscal year of the amount that you had. Then all appropriations, so continuing that and thinking about that, so all appropriations, if they required State Finance Council action, if they required agency head action, division of budget action, that continues. So nothing changes in law from that. So for example, an agency couldn't expend money until approval of another agency or agency head or a body, that still pertains, that action would still have to happen. So nothing changes in regard to that in the bill. And then there's also a provision that, say an appropriation has accomplished its purpose. So we sometimes talk about one-time funding. And so if there was a one-time funding and that's what happened, then that amount of money would be lapsed or retained in the fund because it's accomplished its purpose. So the bill provides that if that money has accomplished its purpose and no longer is necessary, the Secretary of Administration would lapse the appropriation or decrease the balance in the, or excuse me, decrease the expenditure limitation in the fund. Now, just so you know, those provisions don't apply to the legislature or the judicial branch. And so that is just the executive branch from the Department of Administration controlling that. So it would be up to LCC, like, say maybe the revisor's office had asked for a computer upgrade on X. We did that. We had been given, $500,000 for that. It would be up to the LCC in an LCC agency budget to say, well, that amount of money would lapse back into SGF fund because the revisor's office didn't need it anymore. So just an example on what would happen on that. So all continuing appropriations are subject to the specific provisions that if and when the federal government funding or a portion of it is reduced or terminated, then the state participation in the program would be reduced by the Secretary of Administration proportionally to the federal reduction. And so that's just like savings money, because if the feds aren't doing it, our participation wouldn't need to be more, and so that would be lapsed, or the expenditure limitation would be decreased. And then if any continuing appropriation is made to match or secure federal funds is in excess of the amount that we need for that, then before the state agency could actually spend that money, State Finance Council would actually have to approve that. So if there was for example, that the legislature had appropriated $1 million, but only $500,000 was needed. State finance, even before that $500,000 was able to go, State Finance Council would need to review that and approve that, and just sort of like a check and balance to be sure you're reviewing what's going out. And then there may be times when an account or a fund is running low on monies. So there's a provision for temporary reallocations. And so in those instances, they could, the Division of Budget, and many of these things, just so you know, the Secretary of Administration actually does it, but it's in consultation with the Division of Budget and the Division of Legislature, and the Legislative Research Department, I was trying to be sure I said that correctly. But the Director of Legislative Research and the Director of Budget are also involved in looking at these things. And so in regard to temporary allocations, that is exactly one of the cases where it happens, that they would be reviewing that. So if the account or fund balance is running low, then they would review it, and then they would look at it, and if there is money, if they believe that there is money that will be going back into that fund or into that account to cover it, then they will move things around, monies around, and give temporary allocations to a fund to cover that. But there has to be the analysis done. The money will be coming in to be sure that they could be repaid. And so in these sort of instances, that amount of reallocations to an account or fund is limited to $400,000 by the bill, and then they shall limit, and then so the total amount limited of any temporary reallocation at any one time during a fiscal year cannot exceed 9% of the total amount authorized to be expended or transferred by demand transfer from the state general fund. And the Secretary of Administration does that calculation. And then the bill does allow for an additional one-time 3%, but that additional 3% can only happen for a period of 30 days, and then that reallocation cannot be made for more than one time. So that 3% can only be made for one time. And then when they're making these reallocations, the Secretary is supposed to first look at any monies in the Budget Stabilization Fund. And so in doing that accounting procedure, the Secretary of Administration would first look to what's the balances in the Budget Stabilization Fund, and then they would move that money from that fund to these other places, and then of course it would be repaid back at the end of the fiscal year. The Budget Stabilization Fund should be whole of what the amount was when it all started. This also says that, like, if a fund is getting interest right now pursuant to statute, that would continue, that the interest would still go into that fund or account just like it would under law. So that doesn't change. And then the Secretary of Administration is generally responsible for looking at the overall budget situation and the overall revenues, and they can't authorize a temporary reallocation if that action would jeopardize the cash flow in any fund or account from which a temporary reallocation would be made. So they need to be watching and to be sure that the funds are coming, or the revenue is coming in to cover that, because if it's not, then they should not be authorized to do that. And then if the secretary decides to exercise the authority or is proposing to exercise the authority for a temporary reallocation, the secretary is required to publish and transmit a monthly report to Senate Ways and Means and this committee, House Appropriations, specifying the date, amount, source, and use of any outstanding temporary reallocation or proposed reallocation of monies for the period covered by the report. So you guys, if that temporary reallocation is happening, you all would get a report monthly from the secretary, and then Senate Ways and Means would also get that report, so you would know what the temporary reallocations were happening from the secretary. And I'd be pleased to stand for any questions.
All right, thank you, Jill. So you kind of answered my question in regards to the one-time money, if that would happen to be in the budget and this being enacted. What is it if it's perceived to be one-time money, but would that still carry over? You said as long as the purpose is served, the money would not be allocated again. But sometimes there's the perception that it's one-time money, but then it's kind of, I would hate to say baked into the state general fund allocation.
So, sir, that decision would ultimately have to be made by the Secretary of Administration in consultation with Director of Legislative Research and the Division of Budget, but ultimately the buck would stop there. And so I don't think anything would stop members of the legislature or members of the public, frankly, from speaking to the Secretary of Administration about whether it was a one-time, but that's where the decision is ultimately made.
All right, so talking about the Director of Budget, in regards to the Budget Stabilization Fund, isn't it in statute that takes legislative action? So would this change the statute in regards to the Director of Budget allowing him to use the Budget Stabilization Fund?
So I think it's a temporary reallocation. It's not an expenditure from the fund. The reallocation is to be paid back, and it is the job and the duty of the Secretary of Administration not to take that money if they think there is not revenue or other funds coming in to make this fund whole. Like it's short $10 right now, but they believe the $10 will be there, then they can move the money over here for that. But it would be a dereliction of duty not to pay that back.
Okay. So, and then I kind of look at this as, in regards to what Congress has been doing for many years in regards to the budget for the federal government and having continuing resolutions. Is this kind of similar to that?
Well, I mean, to me, the difference is nothing has to happen. If in 2028 the legislature cannot come to an agreement on a bill and nothing is passed, whatever passed in 2027
just automatically goes
correct,
into
sir.
funding
Yes,
the
correct,
government.
sir.
Okay.
If this is law.
Committee, any questions? Representative Wassinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know whether it's a misprint or you misspoke. You said something about 400,000, and in the bill it says
Excuse me, I am so
400
sorry.
million. Yes.
Pardon me.
Okay,
Yes,
there's not
yes.
another.
No.
Okay.
Excuse me. Thank you for
That's all right.
making that clarification. It's 400 million.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Mr.
much.
Chair.
Representative Estes.
Is there a way in which one could perceive this as binding a future legislature, especially if the budget, it's the year that it doesn't pass is a different legislature and we're in the beginning of a new biennium?
Jill.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Estes, I think somebody could sue on that and we'd find out what the court said. I don't know I'm sorry that I don't know the answer, what would happen. Thank you.
Representative Estes. Representative Helgerson.
I'm going to be flipped. Do we still get paid if we don't do the job then?
Jill.
Yeah, you don't have to answer that. I'm playing with you a little bit. First of all, have you done or has research done a point-by-point change in this current statute to what this bill would do?
Jill.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry that I'm not following point by point, so I'm sorry, please, could I have
it's-
more information?
I have a little bit of experience in the appropriation process, and can't find it. I can imagine how members that have not served on the appropriation committee can't go down through the bill and say, this is how it has been done up until this year, and this is how it'll be done in the future, or it could be done in the future. Has anybody started that process?
Jill?
I'm sorry that I'm still not following. Could you give me an exact example?
I'm not familiar with the bill, but it seems, well, first example, and the major one is, if the governor and the legislature don't have an agreement, we basically do whatever was done in the last year.
Correct.
That's a big change.
So playing that out, I mean, I think any additional things that legislature did and isn't funded, then yes, that could be a big change. But I think it would be hard for revisers and KLRD. I don't mean to speak for Dylan, but I think it would be hard to anticipate what a future legislature is going to do and then how it's not funded. So I'm not sure how we'd come up with a point by point unless we were anticipating what might happen.
Okay, I'll work with you on that.
Okay.
But what's it do for bonding or for school finance where we had a court ordering money, and if they don't come to an agreement, are we bound by the previous court decision, or are we bound by what was funded last year?
Jill?
Well, sir, I think that would end up in the courts, and the attorneys would be arguing over what it is. I mean, in regard to bond payments, I think the Secretary of Administration would have to determine if there's other monies in other funds that could be moved around to make bond payments, or if that bond payment of, I'm making this up, if that bond payment of $10,000 doesn't automatically increase to 10.5 to 11, and how that would go up. If they could move around monies to pay those, I just can't answer that question.
Representative Hillerson?
You and I had a good deal of conversation over the last year about what's constitutionally required of the legislature and what the administration can do or can't do or should do. In some ways, we're giving over some of that authority to the administration or to other people, as opposed to every year making a financial decision for the state. Is that, you comfortable answering that, or you don't want to?
Jill?
I think that argument can be made, yes, sir.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'll wait and the rest.
Representative Getz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the overview. In the supplemental note on page 2 at the bottom where it says the opponent testimony, Representative also stated the bill was unconstitutional by a violation of Article 2, Section 24, which is actually very short. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury except in pursuant of a specific appropriation made by law. And the claim in that was that this puts us in an unconstitutional standing. Is there merit to that, or give me a little background there?
Jill?
Mr. Chairman, is there merit to that? I think somebody could sue under that. I think the position of the legislature and the state would be, by law, you are providing for this appropriation for fiscal year X. And that's what it is. It's what was in I'm just making these numbers, or the fiscal years up, but what it is in 27, it just carries over into 28. And so that is what the legislature has determined is the appropriation for the next year.
Representative Getz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm good.
Any further questions for Jill in regards to Senate Bill 14? All right, Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Historically, have there been any examples of the legislature and the governor not passing a budget?
Jill?
Mr. Chairman, ma'am, that has never happened to my knowledge, in the history of Kansas. A budget has always been reached.
Representative Hoy.
Thank you for that information. And then, since this budget would be in effect for additional years until the legislature would amend it, does that mean that there's a new budget that advances that would have, let's say, line item veto capacities, or this is just set in stone with all the parameters like the reallocations report, et cetera?
Jill.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hoy, this does not anticipate, and there is no power for the governor to veto anything in this. It is just a continuing budget, and that's what happens.
Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask a question about the veto, so I appreciate that. Been asking, all right. I'm just reading this, but I'm trying to decide what is the major change here? Because a lot of this we do already. What is the major change?
Jill.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Ballard, I think the major change is if a future legislature could not come to an agreement on a budget bill and nothing is passed, this would allow the government of Kansas to continue, and it would be at the level funding of whatever was passed in the previous fiscal year. And so, I mean, there's been times where we talked about, or we've been asked, like, what happens when, if a budget doesn't pass? I'm not sure we know, but, you know, we've all talked about furloughs. We've talked about who is necessary, thank you, who is an essential employee, who is non-essential. And I mean, we've had those discussions in the past, but it's never reached any point.
So in essence, this is setting up that an alternate can do something with the budget, but it's also setting it up in many ways that you could actually lay people off, you could fire people, you could do a variety of things. Is that also included, but it is not actually being stated?
Jill.
To me, you would have to follow law. So I appreciate where you're headed on that, but I don't think, I mean, I think lack of funding would be a reason that somebody would be let go. But if you're in classified, you would have civil service protections, and you would be able to appeal yours just like you can now. If I was classified and I was let go, I could appeal. And unclassified don't have any appeal rights.
I would say that, you know, just plain and simple, I mean, this is, if we were not able to make a decision in regards to the legislature and the governors, this is just continuing the functioning of government after June 30th, and when the new fiscal year starts on July 1. And so it's just the continuation of the functions of government until a budget can be reached in the next preceding legislation.
Thank you. Okay, that sort of simplifies it. Thank you so much.
Any further questions for Jill? All right, seeing none, thank you, Jill. We'll go ahead and open up the testimony for Senate Bill 14. And this morning we have the pleasure of having the President of the Kansas Senate, Ty Masterson, to approach the committee as a proponent for Senate Bill 14. President Masterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the time. This makes me think, you put 30 smart people in a room and you can make something simple very complicated. Right, so it's really not. And so to go around and answer some of the questions even before I testify, this is what we call on our side the anti-government shutdown bill. So, Representative Ballard, it's the opposite of that. It's to protect that job. It's so your constituents don't hit a closed office or somebody gets laid off on July 1. And I have been here in June. For those of us that have been here, we've been here in June with those threats looming on us, and we don't have a mechanism to protect that. You really do. So when you have an opponent come up and say, well, we might not get the right amount of money for X or Y, well, how about zero? Right, because that's the effect of that. And you're seeing, I don't know how many watched the State of the Union last night, but you saw vehement disagreement. And this is to stop that. So the result of vehement disagreement can't be shut the government down. and your constituents run into closed offices. That's what this is about. Now, you get a deep bill, and Jill did a skillful job putting all the mechanisms in place, but that's what I can hear creating the confusion. Right down to the rainy day fund. Are we accessing the rainy day fund? I think the good example of that, it's cash flow. Right, and we're going to be back. You don't want this to be comfortable. You want to motivate us to get along and have a budget, have the governor sign it, right? That's what you ultimately want. And so you're back in the middle of that fiscal year, right? So you can address some of those adjustments that need to be made, and now you've had time to cool off and work together to have a solution. So that's what that's about. But so probably a good example we have mechanisms like federal grants, or maybe a better example would be tobacco settlement. When that payment comes in, hits Key Fund, goes Children's Initiative Fund, but there are appropriations out of the Children's Initiative Fund. Well, if that settlement doesn't come in time, what this does is allows for internal borrowing so that the function of government maintains smoothness, and then as soon as the Key Fund payment comes in, it replenishes. So it's not drawing from, it's an internal borrowing mechanism to allow all that to function. So it's a lot of words. You'll have a simple bill idea sometimes, and the revisor will come back and it'll be like 18 pages. Right, because you have to do all these other things to make that happen. That's what you're seeing there. You have to have mechanism in place for cash flow, for things to happen. But the concept is very simple. It's anti-government shutdown. It gives us a mechanism, and it doesn't increase appropriation. But for things in law, so the school district, somebody asked finance formula. Can't remember who asked that. That was you, Henry, wasn't it? Sorry, Representative Helgerson. It even has in statute CPI. So the appropriation, to the point of, was it appropriated by the legislature? This is a legislative mechanism, and the bill that was underlying is a specific appropriation by law that you had just put in that year or the year before, right? And so the same thing would apply to, we have appropriation bills that'll do out-year spending. This is an appropriation bill for, 26, 27, 28. So do you have to come back in 27 and redo 28, and you're going back in 20, redo 27? It's the same net effect. It's a continuing appropriation, a specific appropriation by law, by the legislature, that lets the government continue to function July 1. So it's really that simple. And I'd stand for questions at the appropriate time.
All right, thank you, Mr. President. Any questions for President Masterson? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the finance formula, we continue to talk about that with this bill. And currently, and I'll just verify with you, but currently right now in our budget, we do 2 years, the current fiscal year, and the next fiscal year, and then we do the out year for the finance formula. We include special education funding with that, and we include those, the general kind of fund in that. So from looking at your bill, that really wouldn't play as an issue for what you're proposing, correct?
President Masterson.
Correct. You would, for example, so in this bill, it appropriates, in last year's bill, we had appropriation for 25 and 26. If things blew up and we didn't do it, you would have a specific appropriation by law that we all passed and signed for fiscal year 26 that's already in the law, and it would apply.
Representative Williams.
Okay, and then finally on this, basically what this is doing is it's eliminating any new funding above and beyond what has already occurred other than the finance formula, because that's always going to be, we're always going to be 1 year in advance, actually 2 years in advance on the finance formula. And it would not add new programs, correct?
Correct. I think, as a matter of fact, the CPI in education, I think is the only one I'm aware of that has an increase built into statute. And so you may have an example where something was thought to be one-time money and it didn't, but that's something we'd have to be fixed mid-year. You want motivation to come back and get along.
Okay, great. I just wanted everyone to understand that. Thank you.
Any further questions for the president? Representative Estes.
Thank you. It's nice to see my senator at work today.
You're not going to be able to give me any grief on Senate time after this.
Is the answer that you gave Representative Williams the answer to my question about binding a future legislature in the fact that we do appropriate 2 years ahead?
I mean, the clean fact is there's
sorry.
no legislature that can bind a future legislature, right? The new legislature coming in can do anything they wish or wish not to do. But it's the current legislature that it is a specific appropriation by law to the point of Representative Getz. You're not binding.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Turk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in some quiet conversations back here, I've heard some concerns about the governor not having an opportunity to veto this or line item veto any of this. correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially we're taking a budget that the governor, any governor, would have already had already gone through and been able to veto anything, and we're just applying that until we can come to a solution, correct? So they've already had the opportunity to veto whatever they want.
That's a good point. The underlying budget that came through would have been a budget signed by the governor, she or he would have opportunity to line item veto it, and that's the budget that would be moving through. So the specific appropriation would have been the result of a bill that had been signed and line itemed and moved through.
Representative Turk?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in addition, the other side of the coin, we wouldn't have been able to, as a legislature, add anything additional. So it's just the same product. So everybody's fair, correct?
Yeah, no, yeah, it's all fair, and but it's not ideal, right? I mean, to move a budget through, like, it's not ideal. You want motivation to get together and come to a budget. But it simply allows on July 1 for offices to remain open, state employees to be paid, and government to continue until you come to agreement the following session.
Representative Turk?
I think that puts that to rest. Thank you.
Representative Bueller?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just out of curiosity, Mr. President, do any other states do this? I haven't researched that deeply, but are there other models where this is in effect in other states by any chance?
I can't name you the state, but I do believe there's one or two that have a mechanism for that. I want to say Wisconsin has it, because I had a conversation at one of the national groups with the speaker from Wisconsin, and they have a mechanism that's similar.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any further questions for President Masterson? All right. Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I am not showing anybody else that wishes to testify as a proponent for Senate Bill 14. So if there's anybody that wishes to do so, here is your chance. And then I'll go ahead and move on to, we have one individual that is testifying as opponent, and I believe they are online with us on WebEx, and that is Leah Fleiter, the Assistant Executive Director of Advocacy for the Kansas Association of School Boards. Ms. Fleiter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. You have my testimony in front of you, so I won't read it. But I wanted to direct your attention to the second page of my testimony, the last couple of paragraphs, to express our major concerns is that the provisions of the bill, as you know, are triggered if a budget has not been enacted by July 1st of the fiscal year. But unfortunately, for school districts, our staff contracts are already in place and in force for the coming year, and the statutory deadline, which is for adjusting staff, is in mid-May, and so that has long passed. And we are also concerned that this bill doesn't mention changes in caseloads from year to year. So we are concerned that this would create a fiscal crisis for public schools if the legislature and the governor were to fail to come to a budget agreement. I think overall, our global concern is that this bill introduces instability and lack of predictability in the K-12 budget process. I think despite what I think are probably good intentions, it does look like it could give the governor and the legislature sort of an out or a mechanism for failing to agree on a budget, or maybe even cut the education budget without actually passing a budget bill. So we would always hew to transparency and ask that the committee think more about this bill and about the uncertainties that it could entail, and we would ask you to decline to pass the bill out as it's currently written. Thank you.
All right, committee, are there any questions for Ms. Fleiter? Representative Bueller.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I maybe can understand maybe uncertainty, but I don't understand the comment about lack of predictability, because it's clear that what you'd have to do is look at a 2-year budget model as opposed to one. I don't think there's a lack of predictability that couldn't be worked with. I don't know if you have a comment or a perspective on that.
I appreciate that. I think, Representative, that's not laid out in this bill. And, if there's a 2-year budget that's actually appropriated, then that is much more predictable. But this bill does not specifically state that. So I appreciate that opportunity to comment.
Representative Bueller.
Thank you. I appreciate the perspective. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to kind of let everybody know that I will have an amendment on this, and I've worked it out with the Senate President also and the Speaker. My concern was that this does kind of look like it gives the legislature the ability to just say, we don't want to do a budget this year. We'll just, punt. And so the amendment will specify that it has to go through the process. There has to be a veto of the entire budget before sine die, basically before we leave here, and then this would kick in. That's kind of the real easy way of doing it. So it would make us go through the process, or anybody go through the process, and there'd be a veto and everything. So that will be an amendment that we brought.
Any further questions for Ms. Flatter? Representative Turk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just so that I can hear it from you, what is a bigger crisis for you, since I'm seeing through your testimony, crisis. What's a bigger crisis, that we don't have a budget for you, or that we have this in place and you're just a little short, or that whatever scenario you are thinking about that is a quote unquote crisis?
Right. Thank you. The budget bill, this Senate Bill 14, does not make any mention of caseloads, either for K-12 or other human services caseloads. And when there's adjustments in that can severely impact our funding after, on July 1, which is a new fiscal year. So that would be a crisis. If there's a change in caseloads, that's not reflected in that budget document that's envisioned in this bill. So again, if there are amendments that could, sort of clarify that, then it would be much less concerning for us.
Representative Turk.
Yeah, I understand. I got that the first time.
Okay.
What I'm asking is, what's worse, no money or some money?
Some money is definitely better.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So are you, for K-12 purposes, are you speaking of caseloads as enrollment?
Ms. Flatter.
We're talking more, as you kind of noticed in our testimony, about, let's see, I want to direct you to page 2. First, for K-12, as you know, money is taken from the school district finance fund, and then it's appropriated from the state general fund. And so for our issue, the text of the bill is just not clear. If that previous year SGF appropriation is less than what would be needed to fill the gap the following.
Texted you. Representative Williams.
Okay, but I'm still coming back to your comment about K-12 caseloads and your testimony that says caseloads. I understand caseloads as it relates to Medicaid. I don't understand it relating to education, especially considering in the last 5 or 6 or more years, that if you want to call it caseload or enrollment, it has been flat at best or declining at worst. So to me, if we held the schools with previous year and then the finance formula is able to adjust it depending on district ups or downs in enrollment, you'd still come out ahead. So I just want you to explain what you meant about caseloads and impacting K-12.
Ms. Flatter.
Sure. Well, I apologize. I'm not trying to be problematic here. It's just that I think, caseloads, don't they apply to more than just the FTE? There's a whole process that's involved. And so if you would like me to retract that word caseloads, then I would be happy to do that. Our concern is that there are changes that take place in the school finance system, and this bill for us does not clarify that there is not an opportunity for underfunding. So I apologize if I appear contentious or seemed like I was trying to confuse you, because I'm not.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I'm not confused. I just think that the school districts in our state would be aptly funded, because we do a 3-year budget. And so I think they will be aptly funded. And since their enrollment is declining or flat, I don't see a huge shift in that. I don't see any historical data that would show a shift in that. I think this bill would not be a negative impact, would not have a negative impact on K-12. Thank you.
Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me do a clarification. I think basically you just heard that we do a 2-year or 3-year, and when I'm looking at what you wrote here, members believe that the policymaking process around the budget should be transparent. Is your concern that we may have a budget proposed but not agree, and then we stay with maybe last year's budget when we negotiate to stay? I mean, do you feel that really you'll be on the short end of the stick? I'm trying to just figure out which way that would be.
Ms. Flatter.
Thank you. That's our concern because the bill is not real specific about that.
Thank you. And I think that's a concern. Thank you very much.
Any further questions for Ms. Flatter? All right, seeing none. All right, thank you for joining us by WebEx. I'm not showing anybody else that wishes to testify in opponent testimony. So if there is anybody, now is your chance. And I am not showing anybody that has supplied any neutral testimony. So if there's anybody that wishes to testify in neutral, now is your opportunity. All right, seeing none, I'm going to close the hearing on Senate Bill 14. And committee, I would probably be prepared to work this tomorrow. All right, we're going to go ahead and open the informational briefing in regards to nursing across the state of Kansas. And so you should have, I believe it was handed out, a copy of the State of Nursing in Kansas report. If not, it can be picked up over there on the cabinet. So first, in regards to the State of Kansas Nursing Report, I would ask that Amy Garcia, the co-director for the Kansas Nursing Workforce Center at the University of Kansas School of Nursing. Ms. Garcia.
I do have slides to illustrate some of the points. I'm here today to level set about nursing and with no specific ask. The Kansas Nursing Workforce Center is one of the centers in 46 states. Our purpose is to focus on systematic issues and provide data that supports better policy. So we did a listening tour across the state and came up with a mission of ensuring that every Kansan has access to a nurse when and where they need one, and that we support nurses as individuals and members of a healthcare team. Next slide. Yep. Okay. There we go. So the data in the report in front of you comes from a variety of policy level sources. So we worked closely with the agencies, call out to the Board of Nursing, KDADS, the Department of Health and Environment, Labor, Commerce, found them very forthcoming. We also worked with associations and schools with the idea that if I ask how many nurses are there, where are they, you get a dozen different answers. So the purpose here is that we all could work with a common denominator. So we have produced free copies of this report available online and by dashboard. Next slide. Okay. So there are copies by the door. There's a QR code. I get asked a lot by the media about shortages of nursing and the word shortage being used in a generic format. I think it's better to think of it as an imbalance in supply and demand that's worse in some parts of the state and worse in some specialty areas. And so when talking about that, we want to better focus on what the supply and demand are. Next slide. The word nurse means a lot of different things to different people. So I've got a stair-step slide here that goes from entry level up through doctoral prepared nurses. I want to pull out a couple of things. Generally, the higher the education level of the nurse, the broader the scope of practice, the higher the level of responsibility is. It's important when somebody comes to you asking about nursing to figure out, are they asking about nurse aides? Are they asking about registered nurses? Are they asking about advanced practice? So there will be information for you about the different types. So nurses are there. Sometimes I get asked, why should there be scholarship or initiative funds specific to nursing? It is the largest of the healthcare professions, and in the hospital or nursing home, when everybody else goes home, we're still there to be the pharmacist and the therapist and to scrub the floors and whatever needs to be done to take care of Kansans. Next slide. One of the questions that we get asked is, okay, what's the number? There are, as of about a year ago, so I can give you the numbers day by day, but in this chart, there were roughly 62,000 licensed nurses. So that's licensed practical nurse and registered nurses. The problem I have with our demographics is that our average age is about 50. And about 30% of nurses in Kansas indicate that they're going to retire in the next 5 years. There is an issue, and we'll talk in a moment about the supply coming in. Next slide. The most common way to talk about nursing is to talk about the numbers of nurses licensed. So this will always be higher than the number of nurses working. It will always be, because we as nurses hold our licenses until we're about 90, because we might be needed. This map shows a distribution of licensed nurses by county. But that really doesn't tell me a lot other than Johnson County and Sedgwick County have a lot of nurses. It doesn't tell me whether they have the supply appropriate to the demand. So if you'll go to the next slide. We have a map here where we've looked at the saturation of nurses by county. I think this is a lot of truth here. So if you look at the map, the lightest colors are those with the lowest numbers of nurses per 1,000. Worldwide, the number is somewhere around 22. We have that where you get a balance of the supply and demand. We have counties in the state that have less than 10 nurses per 1,000. What happens when there aren't enough nurses is that the hospitals, the clinics, the prisons, anybody that provides health care has to find a nurse somewhere. You can't just take someone off the street and say, you're the nurse today. So contract nursing has just grown exponentially. I know it's a tremendous problem for our forensic locations, for our state hospitals, and frankly, for the critical access hospitals across the state. I would encourage you, as you think about investing in nursing or education, that you think about where we have need. If you'll go to the next slide. This next slide is the one that keeps me up at night. So I told you that roughly 30% of nurses are considering retiring. Our applications to nursing school, our enrollments, are down 38% over the last 10 years here in Kansas. Nationwide, that has turned. We have many states that the enrollments are picking up. The other map, it is where the schools are located, and it corresponds fairly closely to where the shortage is, where we've got deserts of nurses. The thing that I often hear about nursing is, oh, you need more nurses, we'll just allocate more nursing school seats. We've got about 6,000 allocated. We only have about 3,000 students in those seats. We need to focus on some of the systemic issues of making sure that our high school graduates are prepared with the math and English and science needed to get through a nursing education program. We need to make sure that our nursing education programs, particularly those to the west and the south, our community colleges, have the resources they need. They struggle for faculty, and one of the reasons is we require a certain level of education in order to teach nursing, but once you get that education, you can make double in the hospital. So people who choose to teach, my hat is off to them, but we need to think about partnering with our communities and our community colleges in ways that lift that. So next slide. The other way I think about shortages is related to where nurses are choosing to work. So historically, most nurses have worked in hospitals. Right when this report was published, we had nurses coming out of communities back into hospitals. Today in Kansas, about 47% of nurses work in settings throughout the community. There's a long list of these in the report, along with the percentages working by specialty. I want to call out a couple of specialties that you probably hear about in the bills. So long-term care is the one area nationwide that has not recovered well since many left during COVID. Mental health care, forensic nursing, school nursing. We've got issues in forming work environments and preparing those nurses to function in that place. Finally, emergency room nursing is an issue that I'd be happy to stand for. So next slide. I welcome your questions. There's a great deal of information through here on wages, on proportions. We're working on understanding supply and demand better. This is a snapshot in time, but I stand for any questions that you have.
All right. So thank you for being here, Ms. Garcia. So in your testimony, we've had a lot of higher education institutions implementing nursing programs, but forgive me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like we've kind of saturated that because you said, no, did I take that wrong?
I don't think so. So we do have 43 nursing education programs in Kansas. Many of them do not fill their seats. I think more important is why those seats aren't being filled. Often it's because they can't find the faculty to work at the wages that are provided, particularly in the community college settings. It is an expensive discipline, so schools will only fill the seats they can.
Because the reason why I said saturated is because you mentioned like we have like 6,000 slots available, but we only have 3,000
students.
And that's why I was wondering if we were saturating the market. But you're saying there are other complications that are adding to that because of the staffing, obviously, is one of those.
Staffing is one. The ability to have clinical education is another. Many of the schools are implementing skills labs with mannequins. It's a great thing, but it's not cheap.
All right, thank you.
I could go on for hours. I won't.
We have a limited time, so yeah.
Yes.
Representative Williams.
I want to follow up on that. There are 43 nursing education programs. Would you be able to provide us a list of those programs and the number of maximum seats they would have available and the number of filled seats? Because we have appropriated in this committee and in this legislature tiered and non-tiered funding. So we give tiered funding. We give more for programs that require more costs that are associated with it. So I think it would be very helpful to us to understand where these gaps are, and if consolidation is needed to draw more resources, perhaps that's what needs to be done.
So there's a list of the schools in the back of this. The number of seats, I'll work with our Board of Nursing and Board of Regents to, that number's a little harder to get to. I would discourage consolidation in that when a student leaves their community to go to Wichita or Kansas City to go to nursing school, they may or may not go home. And I think the closer we can have education to where people live and where they will work, the better that would be. So it's the distribution problem that you saw on page 13 of the report.
Representative Williams.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would still like to see the number of seats that are filled, maybe for the last several years, 3 years would even be better, at each of these institutions, and what their capacity limit is. I understand there are fluctuations. I understand your concerns about us looking at that, but I do think it's an important discussion and shouldn't be overlooked.
Ms. Garcia.
Absolutely. We'll bring that back to you.
Representative Helgerson.
2 questions for you. We have what I call an indirect model, in that we put money out to the Board of Regents, or we put money to community colleges, et cetera. A direct model would be community college X, we're going to give you this amount of money, and we expect to have this amount of number of graduates to go into our hospitals or doctor's offices. Is that a better model, much more directed toward a specific, it's like a contracted nurses, but we're going to say, we're going to develop that prospect and bring them from the training or the education to they're going to work in the hospitals or in our needs?
Ms. Garcia.
Thank you. That is beyond the scope of what I can talk about. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. Second question, I appreciate that. If you were God, what 3 things would you do?
Ms. Garcia.
If I was God, what 3 things would I do for nursing in Kansas?
With nurses. With nurses.
So I think we've got to strengthen our nurse faculty and our community colleges, the ability to teach nurses in the areas where they're going to be working. I think there's policy level work to be done on the environment in which nurses work. And I think we've got to look at growing nursing from within. So we have a large population who work as nurse aides or work as direct service workers. Those are folks that we ought to be able to help them make the educational journey to become a nurse. 84% of licensed nurses in Kansas are working in nursing today. That is good.
Representative Helgerson.
One that you led to another question, I apologize, is if you go into a nursing home, a majority of the individuals that are starting out are migrants. They have come from another country. This is an entryway job. Has the immigration policy, or not having a good immigration policy, put pressure on us at a lower level to have the nurses' aides and the assistants? And so that was a feeding point for us in the system.
Thank you for the question. I don't know that it's correct, the majority of workers in home health or nursing homes are immigrants. I think there's work to be done to really understand who those people are. My instinct in my 40 years of nursing here is that it is people at the beginning of their education or those who've not had an opportunity for education. I believe there are systemic things we can do to lift anybody who self-selects to work in healthcare to have a higher level of education so that when they are taking care of you or your family or friends, that they provide the best care possible.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Estes.
Thank you. When I reflect on your answer to the chairman, it made me infer something, and I want to make sure that I'm right or wrong in my inference. If we attribute not having full seats to faculty and the other issue you mentioned, is it right to assume that we are turning away students because of a shortage of faculty? How many students do we turn away?
Ms. Garcia.
Thank you for the question. We are right now working with the Board of Regents and the Board of Nursing to do this kind of a study to look at nursing education in Kansas. I don't have an answer for you today. We can bring an answer back to this committee.
Okay.
Representative Estes.
But it's your sense that we have a lot of students who would like to be nurses, and we're not hitting the other end of the problem.
Right. Faculty, clinical sites, scholarships.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, Representative Estes took all my questions. I think she was peeking at my notes over here. But one of them that did, in trying to understand where the choke point is, and I think we're getting to the crux of that matter, why is it that the number of seats per college is difficult to ascertain? I'm not, the seats available, I'm not following that. You said that number was hard to pinpoint, but we still came up with the 6,000 number, so what went into that?
So our Board of Nursing approves the number of seats, and in order to have a seat in your nursing school, you have to show that you can educate this person and give them the clinical experiences they need in order to work. Our state schools, that information is readily available, but that's less than half of our schools are state-funded schools.
Okay. If I could continue.
Representative Sutton.
I wish I had the answer.
Fair enough, fair enough. But that also kind of leads to another question, and I didn't mean to make this run on because I thought all my questions were gone. But if in order to have a seat available, named, this is the number of seats that you have to prove that you can educate that number of seats. We have 6,000 seats and only 3,000 people in, but we're turning people away. I'm trying to figure out how this all works together.
I am too.
Oh, okay.
That's a really great question. I think there's issues related to how many students come in. Students have many opportunities in Kansas. We've got issues related to having enough faculty or having enough clinical sites. I don't know the weighting of those. I think our Board of Regents can give you good information.
Doubtful.
I'm impressed by them. So
All right,
If you ask me this question in a year, I can give you a better answer.
we have two
Thank
other
you.
individuals that wish to ask you some questions, and we do have some other conferees that we need
Thank
to,
you.
to move on. So first, Representative Rogers, and then Representative Mosier.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be quick. Whose responsibility is it to get more APRNs? I think that would help in some of our rural areas to have, because sometimes we get caught up on primary providers, but it seems like as I was looking at the numbers, I'm going, well, now why in the world do we have 20 in all these counties? And I looked and understand to protect. So whose responsibility is that to?
So the market drives the number of APRNs, and then the schools have to step up to educate. We also, as a state, can make an environment that would draw APRNs here. I know that when I look at APRN licenses and where they live, we lose a lot to Tennessee, where they have an easier scope of practice.
Sure.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman,
Real quick.
Contract nursing. To me, if it's all about the dollars here and there, because I know a lot of people get nursing because they love it, but a lot of people love the check. That's what they did during COVID. And we talk about this a lot in this committee. To throw out that number, what a contract nurse can make, I would think that we would have 7,000 for every 6,000 slots.
Ms. Garcia.
So in my practice since 40-plus years, we have had times when we have had more contract nurses and less. Currently in Kansas, it's about 6% of nurses working on a contract basis. I think more of them are coming back. It's really critical for hospitals and long-term care and other employers to have a stable workforce so that people can work in teams and provide the best level of care. I think it's leveling out. I know the legislature asked for disclosures about how many contract nurses, but
Thank you.
yeah,
That's
about
good. Thank you.
6%.
Thank you.
All right, and the final question for you, Ms. Garcia, Representative Mosier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. It was very enlightening. The first thing you said when you were talking about focusing on the systemic issues of why you can't educate more students in the nursing profession, you mentioned their readiness for math, English, and science. Are you saying that there are young adults that want to get into the nursing profession, but they don't have the background coming out of high school that they can succeed in this? I mean, so is there a set of the population that, can't fill the seats because they're not ready to fill the seats?
That's an excellent question. And yes, there is. If I had $1 for everyone who said to me, I always wanted to be a nurse, but I didn't think I could pass chemistry or math. I think there's work to be done both in our middle and high schools, but also with those who would come out of other disciplines and want to be nurses, work to strengthen their, and we at the center are looking at tutoring kinds of things, but to me, it's a systemic issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you for being here, Ms. Garcia, and thank you for the nursing report. Like Representative Mosier mentioned, it has been enlightening in having that report distributed to us. So thank you again.
Thank you, and you know where to find me.
Next, we're going to have a discussion on the nursing program. So I believe she is online due to the weather. So that'll be Carol Moreland, the Executive Administrator for the Kansas Board of Nursing. Ms. Moreland. Is she on WebEx?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you, yes. Please proceed.
All right. Great. Chair, Waymaster, and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to come and give you some information about nursing in Kansas. You've got my handout in front of you, but I'm not going to probably have the time to go over that in more detail, and I don't think I have to, because a lot of what Ms. Garcia said is what I was going to say too, to some extent. The Kansas Board of Nursing is involved in the nursing supply in Kansas. And the two big areas are nursing license and nursing education. So the big thing to remember, I think, about nursing license is you look at the numbers and everything, and I included those in my handout, a table from the last few fiscal years and the total number of licensees that we had in Kansas. But I don't want you to go just by the number of licensees that we have in Kansas, that the Board of Nursing in Kansas issued. Because as you probably know, in 2019, we implemented the Nurse Licensure Compact. And that has made a huge difference. That actually, we are one of 43 states that can issue multi-state licenses to applicants who apply for them. And if a nurse has a multi-state license, they can practice in any of those 43 states. So when you look at the number of licensees we have in Kansas, that is not reflective of all of the nurses who can practice in Kansas. Now, the Nurse Licensure Compact has to do with RNs and LPNs. It does not impact the advanced practice. So that has made a big difference, I think, in the supply. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that. When you look at those numbers of licensees, there's always a big concern about, you see the big drop off from fiscal year 21 to 22. Well, there's a reason for that. Nurses renew their license every 2 years. So you started hitting the 2 years after we joined the compact. We knew when we joined the compact that we were going to lose some licensees who no longer needed a single state license in Kansas because they had a multi-state license. And so that attributes to some of those numbers. Also, we had nurses who retired during COVID. And then we also had some executive orders in which the expiration date of nursing licenses was extended. So some of the nurses actually almost got an additional 18 months that they didn't have to renew their license because of those executive orders. So a lot of that played into some of those numbers. But we are happy to see the numbers going up again, probably not as fast as everyone would like, but I think a positive is that they are going up. And you can see we're of course not to the end of this fiscal year, but we're also still going up. We haven't hit the grad season. The May graduates who come out, we always see a fair number out of there. So you will see that number go up even more by the end of the fiscal year. And then nursing education. I was listening to your discussion with Ms. Garcia, and some of you asked for some data. I think we can get you that data pretty easily. The nursing programs have to do an annual report to us every year, and that covers a lot of this content. So I think probably in a short period of time, we can pull together a report that would have some of this data that you've been asking about. You know, how many seats do they have? How many seats did each one actually fill? What would be the reasons that perhaps they did not fill them? Because I did not go into that great of a detail in this report, but we can certainly get that if you find that that would be helpful. I did list some of the common reasons that have been given to us by the nursing programs as to why they couldn't admit the maximum number. And it's very similar to what you heard Ms. Garcia say. So that's really no surprise. There was a question about some nursing programs turn away applicants, do they, while other ones do not fill? Yes, that certainly happens. And I think we can include that data probably in what we give you also. You know, it's very interesting. Yeah, they don't want to turn away qualified applicants, but sometimes those qualified applicants don't want to go anyplace else to a nursing program. They want to stay in that area for whatever be the reason. I did want to draw your attention to that within the last 5 years, the Board of Nursing has approved 13 more nursing programs. So that's really good, because if you look at the approved admissions, that's 758. Now, some of those actually have not graduated a program yet, because they might be a 2-year program, a 4-year program, something along that line. There was a question about what happens, I think, if the nursing program wants to increase their number of approved students. They have to bring the request to the Board of Nursing. And as long as they can prove that they have faculty, they have clinical sites, they have the resources that they need to support those additional students, they usually get permission from the Board of Nursing to increase their students. But the board just wants to make sure that they have the resources that they need to manage the additional students. And then the last thing that I put in there was the graduate outcomes, because, you know, there's more than just graduation from a nursing program. You have to pass the nursing licensure exam before you're going to get licensed. And so I just included in there, like in 2024 for our RN programs, the first time pass rate, the average was 92.26, where the national is 91.16. And then for practical nursing, it's 93.57%, and the national is 88.38%. So Kansas is above the national on that. I think a lot of the rest of this, Ms. Garcia covered, so I'm not going to take the time because I know there's probably somebody still behind me. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
All right, thank you, Ms. Moreland. Real quick questions from Ms. Moreland, Representative Sutton. And then also committee staff is passing out the Kansas Board of Regents System healthcare programs and financial aid opportunities. So you have a list of all those programs. Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to take another swing at this same question. Maybe I've got it boiled down a little bit more. Here's what I'm trying to rectify in my mind here, or trying to get squared away. The Board of Nursing will only approve the seats for students if they can prove that they have the clinical areas and the faculty and this sort of thing. Great, understood, check. However, students are turned away because of a lack of faculty. How can both of these things exist at the same time?
Ms. Moreland.
Well, I think Ms. Garcia hit on a little bit. When they get education to become faculty, that's great. That's above what they got in nursing school. However, then they, again, can make more money out in non-academic settings. So oftentimes it's not uncommon that they will decide to go where there's more money, really. And some of them, some of the nursing programs have faculty, but perhaps they do not have the education level that they need. So they're willing to be faculty and they're willing to go on and get more education, but perhaps they don't have the funding to do that. They may have to work full time. Going back to school is not an option with everything they have going on. So I think that's something that can definitely be helped if there was something that could be done to help these ones who want to be faculty, but they need more education to be faculty. I think that's definitely an opportunity. And the faculty are not distributed, you know, great across the whole state, obviously. So that plays into it.
Real quick, Representative Sutton.
Well, I'm just, their faculty as far as getting the seats counted for them, but they're not faculty that can actually teach. What are we talking about here?
Ms. Moreland.
I'm sorry, I don't think I understood that first time around. Okay, what happens when they come and they say, I want 50 more seats? Okay, they're going to show that they have faculty. However, those faculty may not stay when they get to the point where they're ready to increase those seats. they may have lost faculty by then. Just because they had those faculty when they brought them doesn't mean those faculty are going to stay all the time. So that plays into it also.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We are going to move on. Thank you, Ms. Marlin, for being on WebEx and joining us this morning. But we're going to go ahead and move on to the state hospital nursing staff. And so I'd ask that the Deputy Secretary for the Kansas Department of Aging and Disability Services, Scott Bruner, address the committee. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Scott Bruner. I'm the Deputy Secretary for KDADS for the hospitals and facilities. You've heard from us before about nursing issues and staffing issues through the budget process, so I don't want to belabor that. And we've brought all the superintendents back in today, and they're the experts, and I want to make sure they have time to give some perspectives from where they sit about nurse staffing and contract and answer your questions. There was one item that I did want to mention from the slide deck that we provided just about what we've been working on at KDADS that's relevant to the question that you've been I don't think you've raised it yet today, but you've kind of drifted around the question as you've explored this topic, is contract staffing and what the rates of pay are relative to what the contracting agencies make and what those actually pay. So last year, this committee formed a subcommittee on contract staffing and met for a number of days exploring the issue, created some recommendations. One of those was to authorize us to do some awarding of bonuses to staff at the state hospitals, and you talked about that last week, so I don't want to repeat. But another item that was in those recommendations was a proviso that authorized KDADS to start gathering some data from supplemental staffing agencies about the rates of pay, how many agencies there are in the state, and again, how many are actually supplying nurses or staff to folks that use contract labor. So we've been gathering that data since last summer. We've been registering supplemental staffing agencies. There's a definition in the proviso that I skipped through, but where the rubber hits the road is on this slide. So we've been registering agencies for the last 6 or 9 months or so, and we've had 120 total staffing agencies that meet the definition of providing supplemental staff. 55 of them have reported to us about how many staff they place, what they charge, and what they pay those nursing staff. And you can see on the chart, we've had a number, about more than half, that haven't reported at all. We do charge a registration fee, and we've been using that to try to gather some of this data. Worked a lot with the Board of Nursing, the agencies that are registered with the state as a contractor to try to reach out to everybody, and we've had some result. But the bottom line is on that chart showing you at the different classification levels of staffing, for those that have reported, what their average charge in the green bar and what they pay those same staff in those classifications in the blue bar. So for registered nurses, the first one on the left, the average charge that goes out to a nursing facility or other healthcare provider is $80.64, and the average amount that they're paying that registered nurse, again across all those that are reporting, was $43.26. And what we're gathering is information about registered nurses, licensed practical nurses, certified nurse aides, and certified medication aides. That's what CNA and CMA mean. We've been gathering this data. We've been reporting it back to the Bethel Committee. We can do more of that and bring more to this committee as your discussion continues. But I did just want to share that we are, again, as you're thinking through this question, the combination of these questions, there is that additional data that we can provide. It's pretty limited in what we've been getting, but it is available for your discussion. So with that, Mr. Chairman, if it's okay, I'm going to bring the superintendents up. I don't think they're going to talk through the slides quite so much. I mostly asked them to give their observations about where they are with the nurse recruiting and staffing, and then available for your questions. And I'd start with Dr. Mike Dixon, who's the superintendent at Parsons and KNI, if that's okay.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bruner. Dr. Dixon, the State Hospital Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm going to be really brief and get it over to Dr. Dinkle and Ashley Byram. I did want to point out slide number 7. We've presented a lot of this data a couple times now, but this is a new slide. It shows all the different, for all 4 hospitals, the budgeted positions and the filled positions. We haven't talked much about the IDD hospitals. With this committee, Parsons and KNI. Parsons does not use contract staff. And K&I does on a limited basis, and we have a plan in place at K&I to eliminate all of our direct care agency staff the end of this month. And we're working with so we'll just have LPNs and RNs as agency at K&I. With that, I can stand for questions, or I could turn it over to Dr. Dinkle.
We'll just go ahead and move on to Dr. Dinkle, the superintendent of Larned State Hospital. Dr. Dinkle.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. As stated, Lindsay Dinkle, superintendent at Larned State Hospital. I will just briefly reflect on mine as I go. I just want to highlight and really honestly emphasize the support of what Ms. Garcia kind of shared with you and what we're actually seeing boots on the ground. And so one thing I wanted to emphasize that Ms. Garcia kind of implied with their education procedures is that there are some 3 critical features out at Larned State Hospital specifically that we're facing. We have to convince individuals to not only go into nursing, but go into a mental health realm or domain of nursing, and not only go into that, but then dive deeper and go into the forensic population as well in nursing. And so typically nurses are not lining up to have to face physical or verbal aggression from their day-to-day care and treatment that they're wanting to provide. Typically, when you think of nursing, you think of someone who's very caring and compassionate and want to provide in that treatment piece. But the reality is when you get into the mental health and the forensic side of that sort of treatment, it's a little bit different picture. And some of our ER nurses sometimes have the opportunity to see what that looks like as some of our individuals are sitting there waiting to get screened into our facilities to help stabilize them. Another piece that I wanted to mention too is the rural aspect of where we're at. I've said this before in another committee, but we don't have a Chick-fil-A, we don't have a Marshall's. So Taco Bell is about as exciting as we can get. And so getting people to come out there and work in that setting adds another limitation to us. And so we are kind of faced with having to look to contract nursing to fill those gaps and holes for us. You'll see with the RN, I'll kind of focus on specifically, starting rate is around that $38.86 price. We're actually closer to an average around $46 an hour of what we're paying for our RNs. A lot of that is because our FTEs, we have a lot of individuals who have a pretty good chunk of years of service with us, so they've been able to grow and increase their pay, but we're sitting even better than what our starting pay looks like on what we're paying, but we're still out in our facility averaging about $90 an hour to pay that same person to do the same job, but only using through contract staffing. So I just wanted to, emphasize that piece with you all. A benefit that we have had with the contract nursing is it has been able to decrease the overtime or the mandates and be able to let people have a better work-life balance. And so although it is a very large expense, having to use those employees, they allow our state employees to actually go home and raise their children and be with their spouses and be able to engage with others, where before you were coming to work and you didn't know if you were going to go home in 12 hours or 16 hours. And so we are extremely appreciative of what the contract staffing has been able to provide in that manner. Something that's been mentioned that I really want to emphasize is, why do you go for contract staffing versus coming FTE? Money is certainly one thing. I like to ask that question when I start orientation the first day of, why are you here? A lot of times if you tell me the reason you're here is money, I kind of give you a look and try to kind of reframe that mindset. But something else that we know the contract nursing staff like is being able to have that flexibility with their schedules. So we have nurses that'll work a ton of hours, and then they'll go and be able to take a month or 2 months off and then come back and start another contract and work a good chunk of time and kind of have that lifestyle rotation in that manner. A lot of individuals also really like the flexibility to move and have change, so that travel aspect is very appealing to them. Going back to that orientation conversation of why are you here, something I hear a lot about, which is what I like to try to take advantage of, is contract nursing seem to always have a trend of, I want a challenge, I want something different. And so I really like to speak up and kind of brag about the fact that, again, working with mental health and working with forensic, we got challenge for you. We're going to develop you as a professional. You're going to walk out of here with skills you didn't have to begin with. And so that is some kind of boots on the ground information I wanted to make sure you guys were aware of with that. The bonus program that was implemented this last fiscal year has certainly helped us with our recruitment efforts. We saw a nice jump in the number of RNs and LPNs and MHEDs that we're able to bring on with our staffing. Not nearly enough to be able to get ourselves back to where we needed to function with less contract, but it's certainly an improvement, and we've been trying to collaborate a lot closer with the schools to try to entice those individuals that do have a little, want to go into the mental health aspect of trying to get them exposed. Of those programs, I want to mention too, we have nearly 20 contracts with different nursing programs across the state to bring the students out and do clinicals and be able to get exposure to our hospitals. So we definitely have the door open for them to come check us out and be exposed to that in their educational career. I think that's the main points I would have hit on for LSH specifically. I can stand for questions.
All right, thank you for being here, Dr. Dinkle, and we're going to go ahead and move on to Ashley Byram, the superintendent for Osawatomie State Hospital.
Thank you.
Ms. Byram.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Ashley Byram, superintendent at Osawatomie State Hospital. Going off kind of what Superintendent Dinkle talked about, we've really been focusing this last year on recruitment and retention. Prior to July 2024, Osawatomie have an average of 103 contract nursing. So not only is that for your RNs, your LPNs, but also our direct care staff. So as of this month, we've gone down to 70. So going from an average of 103 to 70 contract staff was a huge decrease for us. Some of those things that we feel really increased that was, one was the bonuses that we've been able to offer. Not only is it the sign-on and longevity bonuses, but just showing that retention that, yes, we do care about our state employees and thank you for everything that you do. Some of the agency staff saw that. But another thing that we did starting in November, which we've seen with the RN agencies, is that we started a self-scheduling. So those RNs that are coming on state from contract are able to make their own schedules. So that has really assisted. We've recently transferred 4 agency staff to state staff based off that self-scheduling. So that has been very helpful. So in doing that reduction, we've been able to decrease our vacancy rate. So we dropped from about 39% to today being 33%. So other things that we've been focusing on is enhancing our working conditions, but also building our own. So we have a lot of direct care staff coming in right out of high school and trying to talk to them about, okay, are you interested in going to nursing school? And they are. So we've been actually leveraging the programs such as the Kansas Board of Regents Mental Health Scholarship. So right now we have 5 individuals that are going through that. So we're offering, we will help you with your school schedule so that you'll be able to still work, but also go to school using the scholarship with promise to come back and work at the state hospital. So those are some things that we've been able to do to decrease that. But I mean, right now we still rely on those contract nursing. They're still necessary so that we can maintain the safety of our units for both our patients and staff. With that, I'll stand with any questions.
All right, thank you for being here, Ms. Byam, and we're going to move on because of the sake of time for the nursing shortages for the intellectual development, disability, and nursing home populations. And so I would ask Megan Shreve, the Associate Director with InterHab, and then also online we have Allison McCain, the Deputy Director for the Kansas Council of Development Disabilities. Megan.
Thank you so much, Chair Waymaster and members of the committee. I'm happy to join you today. And again, I'm here representing organizations of developmental and intellectual disabilities in Kansas. You've heard from InterHab time after time that we need the ability to build capacity and raise rates for direct support professionals who support Kansans with IDD. Nursing is no different. These IDD providers rely on trained nursing experts across the state to serve the individuals on the IDD waiver. When I spoke with our InterHab Nursing Resource Network, a self-created group of nurses in the IDD field, many of them echoed similar concerns, that nurses in this field have unique sets of challenges and they require a high level of dedication, multitasking, which leads to burnout, making it harder and harder for them to recruit and retain staff. One nurse shared with me that her average caseload is 38 individuals and that she is responsible for a caseload Monday through Friday from 8 to 5 and after-hour calls, which include things like behavioral changes, medication needs, equipment failure, and other emergencies like injuries or falls. She also shared that their organization specifically has had a position open for over a year with 0 applicants, leaving them short-staffed, and many others shared the same concerns. Others reiterated that sharing that the nursing duties for IDD nurses are different than they would be for a hands-on nurse. There's a lot of administrative duties, and that those things are a deterrent for many to work in this area. Many of them operate in their position alone in their organization, and they're responsible for making decisions that other nurses wouldn't have to make, working long hours, nights, weekends, and being overburdened with regulatory tasks. Many IDD providers, as you know, cover very rural areas, and an example shared with me, one nurse is responsible for the entirety of the state, using support staff and LPNs to fill in the gaps. Nurses are just stretched too thin in this area. Frustration also lies in the lack of clear guidance and defined roles within the IDD organizational structure. While nurses care for individuals with complex needs and other different things that would happen than in a hospital situation, they're not healthcare facilities. They provide the lack of nurses, and most operate differently and independently from each other, which is why I got so many differing opinions from this nurses group as I gathered information. A lack of support and authority is a key reason why many of these nurses who are passionate about this field ultimately leave. Another reason they leave is compensation. As you know, and funding in the IDD system continues to be below inflation rates. It's a gap that we're just not able to fill. Just to be clear, nurses have better opportunities in hospitals and working for private practice in their communities. Addition, IDD also have a lot of complex medical needs combined with behavioral challenges that require specialized knowledge in the field. Again, this leads to higher responsibilities and struggles to find individuals who just want to work with the IDD community. The nurses who do work in this field are passionate about what they do and maybe have a sibling, a cousin, a brother who has IDD, and that's why they stay. We know that our programs have better outcomes when qualified nurses on staff are coordinating healthcare for individuals and services, and IDD nurses ensure that individuals have appropriate preventative care, making sure that they aren't having those trips to the emergency department and costing the state even more money. Again, we know that we need nurses for the best outcomes for Kansans with IDD, and we would love to address the continued shortage of nurses in the IDD field. And I'll stand for questions.
All right, thank you for being here, Ms. Shreve. And then I was going to open it up for Allison McCain joining us on WebEx if she had any additional comments.
Yes. Can I share with you? Our IDD communities hit.
Oh, there we go. You're better now. You're cutting out.
Oh, okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. So I just want to echo what Megan said. Our IDD population, those who are served on the waiver, a lot of people qualify for in-home care, in-home nurses, home health aides, but they aren't able to find someone to fill those roles. I just want to share a little bit Hudson's story. This is one of our council members on the left. She has a daughter named Hudson who qualifies for 350 hours of in-home nursing through HCBS waiver services, but they are only able to fill 192 right now. That's 158 hours that the parents then have to fill. The parents have to stay up all through the night to monitor Hudson and her equipment, her medical equipment. Despite 4 agencies searching, they've had 0 interviews since September of 2024. Here's that pay gap. So their nurses who provide home health aid are $29 to $31 an hour, whereas an RN can go work in a clinic for $40 to $60 an hour. We also have a story from Dr. Gaffney, who is a primary care physician, who is the only PCP in Kansas who serves adults with IDD, specializes in adults with IDD. She hasn't had a nurse in her clinic for over 3 months. And she says this is due to insufficient incentives to work with our population because of their complex needs, lack of exposure to this population in a nursing education setting. And that is all I would like to add. Thank you for your time.
All right, and thank you for joining us, Ms. McCain. Committee, I do apologize that with the sake of time, we weren't able to have questions being asked by the latter of the conferees because we do need to be on the floor in about 10 minutes. So I do think this was enlightening, having all the individuals come in and discuss the array of issues that compound in regards to nursing across the state of Kansas, as we mentioned in the budget. Hopefully we can have an interim committee that's going to be set up to meet in regards to contract nursing, specifically within our state hospitals. So with that, we are adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.